So today's webinar is going to cover N2WS Backup and Recovery version 4.2. My name is Ezra. I'm going to be moderating this. I'm joined today by our Principal Solutions Architect, Sebastian. He's going to do all the hard work and heavy lifting. Just a bit of background. We're a backup and recovery tool that's sold in AWS Marketplace. We've been working on backup and recovery for in-cloud workloads since 2012, and we're the top rated solution on AWS Marketplace for backup and overall in-cloud workloads. We're purpose-built for workloads running on AWS and now on Microsoft Azure, and we have thousands of global clients backing up hundreds of thousands of EC2 instances and VMs. And you can see that in the AWS ecosystem, we have a storage competency and a government software competency, and we're also focused on selling through AWS Marketplace, also have a strong public sector business, and we're an Outpost-ready product for customers that are leveraging AWS Outposts. And on the next slide here, some of the enhancements prior to version 4.2. So this is some of the stuff we announced kind of leading up to where we are today. This was all announced in the past 6 to 8 months. This includes backup and recovery for Azure VMs and our availability in Azure Marketplace, immutable backups for both AWS and Azure, support for SAP HANA on AWS, and some Amazon FSx for NetApp ONTAP and Aurora Serverless, and a whole bunch of other capabilities. We're not here to talk about any of this today. We're here to talk about what we've built on top of that. And for that, I will turn it over to Sebastian.
Yes, my name is Sebastian Straub. I'm the Principal Solutions Architect at N2WS. And let's dive into today's topic. Some of the new features that you're going to find in 4.2. First one is we now have support for Amazon Document DB. In case you're wondering what that is, it's a service within AWS, and essentially it's a version of MongoDB. It's a NoSQL database. And as you can tell, there's always new services coming, and probably in the last few minutes since this call started, AWS probably announced 3 new services. So we're very happy that we now have the ability to perform backups of Document DB as well. The next one is now we do have also support for FSx OpenZFS. So previously we already supported Lustre, Windows, FSx ONTAP with the last release, and now we also have support for OpenZFS. So it's a completely new service within FSx that we are now supporting as far as backup services are concerned. And this brings me to the next feature within FSx. So we're bundling this together, which is a new DR capability for FSx. So previously, as I mentioned, we already supported Lustre, Windows. We do support ONTAP, chosen X there, but that means that's just for the disaster recovery capability. So we do support backing up ONTAP. And now we also have OpenZFS. And now for Lustre, Windows, and OpenZFS, we now have full DR capability, cross-region, cross-account, just in case if you want to make sure that if a region fails or if an account fails for whatever region, then you have the ability to fall back on your backups in other regions, in other accounts. Another feature that we have now is disaster recovery capability for Amazon Redshift. So Redshift is a service that we supported for quite a long time, but now we also have the ability to use cross-region support for Amazon Redshift as well. Infrastructure backup for Amazon VPCs. So previously, long time ago, I think in 2018, we started backing up the network configuration. Why is that important? Well, if we were to talk about on-prem servers, and I would say, I'm going to bring back one of your on-prem servers and I'm going to put it on your desk, but I'm not going to give you any routers, no switches, no cables, no connectivity. You'd probably say, that's not going to do me much good. Well, it's not any different in the cloud. So if you don't have the capability of bringing resources back the way they were meant to be, and people can actually access them and have access to the resources, what's the point? So we do have the ability, and we already had the ability to perform backups off VPC settings, subnet settings, routing tables, security groups, transit gateways, VPN connections, any meaningful object within your network configuration we can now back up. where we can capture it, we can clone it, we can export it, which means even if you didn't start with infrastructure as code, we can turn your infrastructure into code. And that's going to make the disaster recovery capability very easy. And then with the enhanced capabilities that we have now, we also support IPv6. If you've been thinking about rolling out IPv6 to your environment, there's a pretty good business case for deploying IPv6 now, because AWS has announced that from February 1st in 2024, they'll charge per IP, and it's $0.005 per IP that you're using within IPv4 per hour for all public IPv4 addresses, whether they're attached to an AWS service or not. So that means if you have servers that are always on and that require an IPv4, that's roughly about $44 for each IP on an annual basis. If you have hundreds of servers, perhaps thousands of servers, because our solution does scale very easily to thousands, tens of thousands of servers, that's going to make a huge difference. So not only having the ability to use shared transit gateways, but also the ability to capture IPv6 is included in the product now. Accurate volume usage. So for the users who are already familiar with our product, we have the ability to report on what we are seeing in your resources. Why is that useful? Well, because we're touching your data in order to perform backups, why not report on what we're seeing in your environment? For example, if you have a SQL server and that machine is 99% full, I think we all know when that is going to fill up all the way to 100%. It's probably going to be on a Saturday evening or a Sunday morning at 3 a.m. And in order to prevent that from happening, we have the ability to report on what we're seeing on those resources that we're backing up, and then alert to the fact that they're about full. And you can choose, alert me when it's 80%, alert me when it's 85, 90, 95, whatever you feel comfortable with. So the new feature in 4.2 now is very accurate. What that means is previously the way we ascertained how much data is being used on each volume is using the block level information that comes from the snapshots. It's pretty good, but it's not down to the byte. So now using 4.2, we have the ability to actually connect to SSM agents, which might be installed on your infrastructure. And if you have Amazon instances, it will be installed. And then we can attach to that and then read to the byte exactly what the volume usage is on the resources that we're backing up. Now, we also have some recovery operation enhancements. So we now have the ability to apply custom tags during recovery. What does that mean? Well, we, of course, preserve any tags that are located on a resource. So anything that you have, even tags that are attached to a resource, we have the ability to preserve these and recreate them when we're performing a recovery. But now we also have the ability to apply additional custom tags during a recovery. So what I'd like to do is I'll show you how that works. So what you're seeing here on the screen right now, well, that's the console of 4.2. So when I go to my backup monitor, I can go to a resource. This one just contains most of my Windows servers. So what I'm going to do is I'll click on Recover. And then I'm going to click on the resource itself. That's my server. And see, this is the custom tag that we now support. So Open Tag Assistant. And this shows you all of the different tags that are already assigned to your resources. So it's not just at the instance level, at the resource itself, but it even goes further down depending on what service we're talking about. So in this particular case, well, there are some volumes, and then I can see the different tags that are attached to these volumes. I can see the different tags that are attached to the instance itself, and then the tag value. And you can even see the resource ID where this information is coming from. Now you can overwrite this if you want to, or, and this is where it gets interesting, you can also choose to add additional ones. In case you're wondering, why is this useful? Why would I want to ever use this? Well, when you perform a recovery or maybe a test environment, maybe you want to perform a Xerox copy of your existing production environment and perform testing on this. Well, how would I be able to tell that the instances that I'm looking at They're actually recovered instances. They're test instances. Well, with that, I can. So, for example, I could assign a tag recovered, and I'm going to say yes, or test environment, or I'm going to give it a name, or when should we delete this test environment? So all of these different items I can then add to the recovered instances and assign automatically these custom tags to these resources. So that's what the tag assistant allows you to do now.
Any of the tags that I add into those custom tags, when that resource is recovered, that tag schema will be applied. Is that the idea?
That's correct. So what you could do with this as well, so as I said, if you want to signify that the resource that you're spinning up is actually a recovered instance, or perhaps it belongs now to a different team and I can add these resources. But let's say I want to eventually include these resources that I'm spinning up perhaps into a different backup policy. And without me having to do any of this manually, I can just simply then use the tag collection feature, change the tag that we're going to apply, and then they're going to be automatically collected based on these new tags. So that's something that you can do with the custom tags as well. Another feature that I wanted to talk to you about is when you perform backups, the very next thing you're probably thinking of, well, what's going to happen if a region goes down? So, well, that's disaster recovery. So let's talk about that for a moment. So disaster recovery, obviously you heard about this before many, many times. So when you create a backup policy, you can choose the different resources, what is being backed up, and of course, they're using cloud native methods. That's what makes us so fast. And the snapshots are going to be stored in the region where the data is currently residing. It's pretty good, but it doesn't really get you disaster recovery capability. So turning on disaster recovery capability then allows you to perform additional backups of the resource in other regions and even in other AWS accounts. So that means that if a region fails, and it's not like that has never happened before, just last year, North Virginia went down for an extended period of time, I now have the ability to spin up these resources in the other region, or I want to spin up the resource in an entirely different account. So that would also then prevent ransomware attacks, because I now have the ability to spin up these resources in a different account. It's a great feature, and we've had this for a very long time. The only problem with this peace of mind is it's going to cost you money. Like so many things in life, anything that's worth doing in this particular case will cost you money, because effectively it would double your backup cost, because you're creating additional backups of the resource in other regions or in other accounts. Now, we do have the ability to give you that peace of mind with an absolute marginal increase in the backup cost. And the way we do that in 4.2 is with lifecycle management. Up here, previously, you chose how many generations of cloud native snapshots would you like to keep. But now you have a completely separate setting for your DR backups. So you can choose, well, I only want to keep a certain number of generations of these backups in my designated disaster recovery region. In my case, I'm just keeping one, because let's face it, if something terrible does happen and an entire region fails, nobody's going to say, oh, I want all of my servers to be exactly in the state they were in 28 days ago. Well, of course not. You want to fall back onto the most recent backup, and that's what is addressed here. Now, if you want to be a little bit more lenient, you could say, well, let's keep the last 3, so that in my case, I'm performing daily backups. I'm being super conservative. I can go back 3 days and get the data from my disaster recovery region. So this will help you tremendously just to cut down on costs, because, well, you don't need to retain all of these backups in both regions, in both accounts, and keep paying AWS for the backups. That's what the DR cost optimization will allow you to do. So keeping DR backups, but only a limited set of DR backups, really just the ones that you need. No longer the ones that you absolutely want to keep for a long period of time. The next feature that we implemented is multi-factor authentication. This is a completely standalone multi-factor authentication method. So previously, we supported identity service providers, Okta, Ping, OneLogin, Active Directory, Federation Services, you name it. Any type of multi-factor, fingerprints, smart cards, tokens, you name it. But that also required for you to roll out an identity service provider. Now, that's no longer the case. You can log in using multi-factor authentication into the N2WS backup and recovery console. Now, if you're wondering, so which authenticators are actually supported? The good news is any and all. Google, Microsoft, Salesforce, any type of authenticator you can run on your phones will work just fine. If you don't want to roll out any authenticator apps onto your phones, well, you can still use multi-factor authentication. You can then generate a token in your email address. So when you try to log in, it's going to say, well, that's who you are. And would you like to log in? Yes, I would. It's going to send you an email with the token that you can then use to log into the console. Will tremendously increase the security of the console. Talking about security enhancements as far as password rules are concerned. Previously in 4.0 and 4.1, you already saw that we included dictionaries for often used passwords, password 123, 12345, and a whole bunch. There's several thousands was already included. But sometimes it was a little bit confusing because there are just so many different features for the different password settings. We listened and we simplified the management of these different passwords and how you can set them up, expiration history, you can't reuse passwords, limit commonly used passwords. As you can see, within the security settings, that has been increased and it's much easier to use now. Another feature that's completely new is export tables. I would say this is a quality of life enhancement in the product that I'm pretty sure you're going to enjoy quite a bit. This means anywhere within the product, wherever you can see information in tables, that information can now be exported. Let me show you what that looks like. So when you go into our product, and let's say I'm going to go into the backup monitor. The backup monitor is your single pane of glass. That's going to show you all of the backups that you've performed. Doesn't make any difference in which account, in which region. Doesn't even matter in which cloud provider, because we do support a single pane of glass. So I can say, well, show me all of my AWS resources, show me my Azure resources, only show me certain resources. You can even search for tags that are attached that we preserve to these resources. And wouldn't it be great, once you have the information that you actually wanted to see on screen, to now be able to export that information in case you need to write a report? Well, now you can. See over here, export table. Anything that you see on the screen can now be exported, and you can have the choice between these different formats, how you would like to export that information. This not only works with the backup monitor, but this also works with any information that's being displayed within the product. So if I go to my policies, yes, I also have that export table functionality here now as well. If I want to export my logs for the recoveries, I can do that as well. Everything that can be reviewed within the product now has this export table functionality, which then very conveniently allows me to export anything that I'm seeing. Of course, you still have the report capability that was already part of the product, but this is really very nice because it's ad hoc. Whatever I'm seeing on the screen, that's what I want to export, and I even have the option to choose the different formats.
Before you jump into agentless backup, there's a question about our support for NVMe EBS volumes.
Yeah, that shouldn't be a problem at all. So the only thing that is an issue is if you have spanned volumes. You can back up the spanned volumes. The only thing that you can do, we do have the ability to do file-level recovery. File-level recovery allows you to go into the backups and recover certain files and folders. And this is really convenient. Now, one thing that is an issue is if you have spanned volumes, and the only way you would know where that data is located on a spanned volume is if you actually have access to the infrastructure, to the file structure of those. which then, of course, also means that we need to see and be able to access what you're storing. One of the things that especially the government loves about our product is the ability that we don't actually have to know what it is that we're backing up, because we're having a very holistic approach. We're seeing a resource and we back it up without needing to see file by file and folder by folder. So span volumes, that's not something that's supported. But if it is a single volume that's attached, not a problem at all.
Awesome. Thank you.
Sure. Let's dive a little bit into Azure, because that's where you're going to find a lot of new features as well. So agentless backup for Microsoft SQL. Azure SQL works slightly differently than AWS RDS. In 4.1, we were able to provide backups for instances with public IPs. But now we also cover private IPs as well, which means that we have now complete coverage, agentless backup for Azure SQL backups as well. The next thing is something that our customers already enjoyed for quite a long time, is recovery scenarios for AWS. So recovery scenarios, think of that as playbooks on how should failover occur. Yes, within the product, I can choose each and every single product, each and every resource, and click on recover. But as I mentioned, if you have 200 servers, 2,000 servers, 20,000 servers, yeah, I guess you could click recover 20,000 times, but that's going to get boring real quick. So that's why you have the recovery scenarios. We now have feature parity with that feature for Azure as well. So now you can use recovery scenarios, playbooks on how a recovery should occur. For those of you who aren't familiar with the feature yet, let me show. So over here under recovery scenarios, and as you can see, I have a bunch of these recoveries already pre-planned. This one is pretty simple. It's a failover from Virginia to Ohio in my original account. This one, Binola, is exactly the same. It's from Virginia to Ohio, but at the same time, it's essentially worst case scenario. It's also going to perform a failover into a different account. Now we have the ability to also do this for Azure as well. So here I have some of my Azure resources, and the way this works is laughably easy. All you have to do is just simply choose the destination account, the destination location where you want this to be stood up, and then choose the different resources. In my case, it's only one Azure workload, but if you have 10, 200, 2,000, not a problem at all. That's also why the recovery order becomes really interesting, because sometimes certain machines like to spin up before others. I'm looking at you, Windows. And on these resources, now you also have the ability to make configuration changes. So when you click on configure, right now you see everything is auto-assigned, which means, well, we're going to recover that resource exactly as it was when we performed a backup. But you can change your mind. So you can put it into a different resource group. You can put it into a different availability zone. All of this can be overwritten very easily, and you can just simply make the changes. Then once you have this all set up, well, at that point, it's really just 3 mouse clicks to perform a complete failover. All I need to do at that point is just choose my recovery scenario, which can contain any number of resources. Just simply click on Run Scenario, and then it's going to perform a failover on any of the backup sets of your choosing. This feature can also be used for DR testing. So how can I prove that my backups actually work? Well, through DR testing. And that's usually, it's a project, right? So the way you can actually achieve this through this product is within the recovery scenario. Down here, there's a schedule. And as luck would have it, I already have a schedule. These work just like the backup schedules. So what I did is I created one called quarterly. So every 90 days, I want to perform a DR test to actually prove that my backups work. And here I have the option to spin up the resources. The only problem with this is it's going to cost you. And this has nothing to do with us. This is basically just AWS or Azure saying, hey, you're spinning up resources. We're going to charge you for every minute that those resources are actually active. There's another option, which is dry run. Dry run is almost as good as spinning it up. Dry run is going to check, do I have access to the snapshots? Do I have access to the permissions? Do I have access to the encryption keys? Do I have access to the reads? Do I actually have everything I need just short of spinning up the resources. I would say that gets you 98% there. And then there's also no cost involved. Wouldn't it be great that after this test, either spinning them up or performing a dry run, I would get a report? Well, you can. So this means I can now simply click the Save button, and then it's going to generate a disaster recovery test report on a quarterly basis, and it's going to email it to me. And then I can take that report and submit it with my DR testing. The reason why companies usually don't perform DR tests very often, maybe once, twice a year, is, as I mentioned, it's a project. It takes a long time. And the other thing is, well, it also costs money, and well, that's why customers usually don't perform DR testing that often. But if you're using the dry run capability, and if the system is completely automated, well, why not do it more often? There's nothing to keep me from performing DR tests on a weekly basis. Product is just going to do it, and at the end, it's going to provide me with the report to do it. So recovery scenarios, it's a great feature to be able to say, yes, not only are we performing backups, but I can also prove that these backups are working. And if something terrible happens, and you know that terrible dark day does come, all it's going to take is 3 mouse clicks to perform a failover of an entire environment very, very quickly. So that's a new feature now, providing the recovery scenarios for Azure workloads as well.
Just a quick question here. For our N2WS customers, what do they need in order to gain access to these Azure capabilities? Is there any work on their end that they need to do?
That's a really good question, and that's the absolute beauty of our product. So if you have N2WS Backup and Recovery deployed in AWS, or let's say, heaven forbid, you deployed it from the Azure marketplace, well, then you have a product which works completely fluid between both cloud offerings. That means if I want to perform backup and restore of a resource in AWS, sure, you can do this. And you can do exactly the same thing also in Azure. There is nothing you need to do. You can do this right now with your deployed N2WS Backup and Recovery. The way you get access into these accounts is pretty simple. So over here under accounts, you give us access to different AWS accounts that you have access to. And if you want us to also perform backups in Azure, well, guess what? All you need to do is just click on New. You want to define a new Azure account, and then all we need is just a tenant ID, a client ID, and the client secret, and presto, voila, we then have access to the Azure account. We can perform backups in it. And as far as the licensing is concerned, go ahead. If you own N2WS Backup and Recovery, your license transfers automatically to the different cloud resources. If you're performing a backup of a server in AWS, or if you're performing a backup of a server in Azure, makes absolutely no difference. It's completely fluid.
If you're on one of our editions and there's an instance limit, that limit applies to whether that instance or VM is running in AWS or Azure. Is that
Yeah, that's right. And it's really nice because there is no waste. You don't have any license waste where you're saying, well, unfortunately, we didn't license enough for Azure, or we didn't license enough for AWS, because it's completely fluid. The licenses that you purchase will apply to both cloud providers.
Awesome. Thank you.
Sure. Staying with the Azure theme, again, feature parity for Azure, file level recovery for Azure VMs. So you're already familiar with file level recovery for resources within AWS. What does that mean? Well, disasters happen in all shapes and sizes, right? It doesn't have to be your entire environment or an entire server or an entire volume. Probably more often than not, it's going to be somebody saying, oh, I'm missing a file or a folder. And when that happens, well, then you want to perform a surgically precise recovery of that resource. And the way this works is pretty simple. So in the backup monitor, find your resource, click on Recover, and then choose the resource, and there it is, Explore Volume Files. What this allows you to do, even though we're using block storage snapshots in AWS and now also in Azure, you have the ability to dive into the contents of that resource. And as I said, feature parity. So everything that we have been able to do in AWS, we're now also able to do in Azure. This means multi-generational file and folder level recovery. That's a really fancy way of saying we can open a whole bunch of backups all at the same time. Because as I mentioned, when somebody comes to you and says, I'm missing a file or a folder, I know what you're going to say. You're going to say, when was the last time you had that file or that folder? And I also know what they're going to answer. They're going to say, I don't know. Well, that's terrible because now I need to browse through all of my different backups, possibly weeks, to find that file or that folder that you're looking for. So when I do an explore volume files on a resource within N2WS Backup and Recovery, it's going to say, sure, I have all of these backups available. How many would you like me to open? So now I have the choice. And then when I click on Start Session, I can then open the contents of that backup. So in my case, if I chose 4, and this is in AWS, as you can see, because that's an AWS instance, then I can browse through this. This just happens to be a Windows file server, but it makes absolutely no difference because N2WS Backup and Recovery is completely OS agnostic. Doesn't care if it's Windows, doesn't care if it's Linux. But as I mentioned, now we have the same capability also for Azure. So when I choose over here, this is an Azure workload, and I can start browsing through it. As you see, in this case, that's a Linux instance, and I can just simply browse through this. Remember when I mentioned, well, when was the last time you had that file or that folder? Here is the search capability, which then means I can browse through all of these different days. So that's the 7th, that's the 8th, and I can browse through the different dates all at once with that search capability. The best part, the absolute best part is there is no pre-planning necessary for this. There is no agent required. There's no pre-cataloging, pre-indexing of the content. You can do this ad hoc whenever you want to for both clouds now, AWS and also for Azure. So this really makes your life a lot easier because you can do this without having to pre-plan any of this, and with surgical precision, you can go in and retrieve exactly what you need. Now, the next part is immutability. Within Azure, not only are we creating the equivalent of snapshots, but now we also have the ability to use immutable backups within Azure without the need to archive the data into an equivalent of S3. And if you're wondering, how does that work? That is super simple to implement. So let me show you how that works. Over here, I have an Azure backup policy that contains some of my Azure resources. And all you need to do is just click on More Options, and there it is, Enable Immutable Backups. So this then allows you to perform immutable backups, snapshot equivalents within Azure without having the need to actually archive the data first into an S3 component. So this adds another layer of security. Cross-cloud capabilities. Dare I say it? That's almost like the holy grail for backups. So we are a cloud native backup solution which now has cross-cloud capabilities, which means you have the ability to perform backups in AWS and then store the resulting backup in Azure Cloud. And then on top of that, I also have the ability to take these AWS backups, which I can store in the Azure Cloud. I can then make those backups immutable. Immutable archives and disaster recovery snapshots are, I'd say, undoubtedly a vital tool in any robust data protection strategy. And those ensure that valuable information is securely stored and can be swiftly retrieved in the event of an unexpected failure. However, the ultimate peace of mind comes from implementing a multi-cloud strategy. So by storing backups in an entirely different cloud provider, coupled with a time lock, you're not just adding another layer of security, you're practically fortifying your data in an impenetrable vault. And these backups, they become immutable, unchanging over time, impervious to alterations or accidental deletions. And if, for a moment, we imagine your AWS cloud and its defenses as a castle, well, if a hacker or a ransomware solution finally manages to hack or penetrate your AWS cloud, they'll be greeted with the knowledge that the princess is in another castle. It's the equivalent of putting your data into an entirely different castle, safe, secure, and ready for action whenever needed. Not only are you storing your most precious, valuable data in an entirely different castle, you're also putting it into the deepest dungeon for safekeeping. That's what the immutability will allow you to do. And I would say in today's digital landscape, this isn't just a smart move, it's an absolute necessity. Now, if you're wondering, well, why would I really need this? Putting my backups, my AWS backups, into the AWS cloud. Sounds interesting. Well, let's talk money. Because nobody likes paying for backups. It's like car insurance. Nobody likes paying car insurance, but wow, is it useful when there's an accident? So let's compare storage costs. If we're comparing apples to apples, within Azure, they have something called hot storage, and in AWS, the equivalent would be standard S3. That's the cost per gig per month in AWS. That's the cost in Azure. It's a tiny little bit cheaper. So Azure is really trying to be very attractive for storage of data. Azure also has cool storage, 30-day minimum retention. The equivalent in AWS would be S3 infrequent access, also 30-day, and that's the cost. And as you can see, once again, Azure beats AWS as far as storage cost is concerned. And keep in mind, there are no ingress charges for either AWS or Azure. So that means when you're storing your AWS backup in Azure, well, there is no cost if you're storing the data in Azure. But let's go into details now. So let's say if I have, let's say I have 500 gigs, and that's what I try to represent here. There are different tiers, and they're trying to confuse you with, well, how much are you retrieving? So I try to go through the different tiers. So first gig per month is free. Great. And then if you retrieve more than 5 gigs, well, it's going to be that expensive, and so on and so on. As a matter of fact, if for whatever reason you would be restoring more than 50 terabytes per month, well, Microsoft says, talk to us. We're going to cut you a deal. And AWS has a specific price for each of these tiers as well. So do not put all your eggs into the same basket. So that's one thing. And the other is, well, it's a tremendous security increase, because not only are you storing your data, your backup data, in a completely different storage facility, but you're storing it in a completely different cloud provider, which means even if that crazy situation were to happen, that there is a hacker or ransomware just going to penetrate your defenses in one cloud provider, well, what are the chances of them also penetrating the defenses of a completely different cloud provider? Something else that you should also take into consideration, once the data is archived, once the data is in an archive, either in Azure or in AWS, that can also serve as your DR backup. You're probably going to get confused now, but let me show you what I'm talking about. So when you perform backups and DR backups in AWS or in Azure, I have that configured in this backup policy. So when I click on recover, of course, I can recover the data wherever the data is currently located. But if I perform DR, then I can also perform a recovery of the data in my designated disaster recovery region. So in my case, I'm storing all of my backup in North Virginia, and my disaster recovery data is located in Ohio, because nothing bad ever happens in Ohio, right? So this is one of my policies. This one backs up most of my Linux servers. So when I click on recover, then over here, that's where the data is located, North Virginia, just as before. But I also have the option to restore the data to, well, not only the original region, but I can recover it anywhere. There's no pre-planning required for this either. So if my boss says, I want to perform a disaster recovery in London, sure, it's no problem, because the data is coming from an archive. And we're rehydrating the data in the other region. I can do the same thing for any other account. So even if the data doesn't exist in my disaster recovery account, it exists somewhere, perhaps in a different cloud provider, such as Azure, I could then recover the data in any AWS account, in any AWS region, because we're already performing the rehydration of that data.
So can we just take a second to like unpack that a little? So
sure.
I'm taking a backup, like a EBS snapshot, and then I'm moving it into archive, right?
Mhm.
And that you're saying that archive can exist either in Amazon S3 or within Azure Blob?
That's correct.
And what about recovery times? Because that has to be a consideration here. So is there a difference in recovery time, whether I'm recovering? Because I'm assuming we're not recovering to Azure, we're recovering back to AWS. Is that?
That's correct. So that's why when you create your backup policies, you want to think about how quickly would you like to be able to recover. Remember when I mentioned we do use cloud native snapshots. There's literally nothing faster than that, but not all data needs to be available within seconds. I mean, there is a reason why Jeff Bezos has his own space program. It's probably based on snapshots. So that's why keep the minimum amount of cloud native snapshots that you want to be able to recover from with near zero RTO. The same thing also goes for your DR and the archive. You're absolutely right. Archive is tremendously more affordable, but it takes a little bit longer to recover. So generally, I would say rule of thumb is anywhere between 3 to 5 times as long. So if you're trying out our product or you're already using our product and you find that resources take a certain number of seconds to recover from a snapshot, well, it will take a little bit longer. But I don't think anybody's going to cry, especially if you tell them, oh yeah, the data is now stored in an archive. And by the way, we're just paying 2% of what we generally pay for a snapshot, because that is really the maximum savings. So if you store the data in an archive.
For your example of a 500 gigabyte volume, what's the like a stab in the dark time frame to recover from Azure back to production state in AWS?
Well, it really wildly depends on how many people are accessing the resource. I mean, even AWS, even Azure, they will never tell you a specific time frame. Nobody's ever going to tell you, oh, it's going to take 15 seconds, it's going to take 30 seconds, because half the world is using their resources. So yes, there is something to be said about trial of the product. And if you're already familiar with our product, try it out right now. You can. And if you don't have our product yet, well, that's why we have the free trial. Anything that we talk about in our webinars, anything that we talk about in our advertisements, well, all of that can be verified. So just install it. The installation takes about 20 minutes, and you can try it out how quickly it recovers in your designated regions. Because even within AWS, access time into Singapore is considerably slower than access time into North Virginia.
One more question on this. What about things like file level recovery if it's stored in Azure? Is that still a capability?
For sure. As a matter of fact, that screen that you see right here, that is actually a resource that I have stored in Azure, and I can do file level recovery. If you want to do this is probably my most extreme backup policy. So that is my Windows resource. It lives in AWS. So as you can see, there's the instance ID. And that data is actually being stored in lifecycle management. So if you take a look over here, the storage repository, I'm keeping the data in Azure in an immutable format. I can recover still file and folder level recovery of an AWS resource stored in Azure in an immutable storage facility and do file and folder level recovery. That's possible as well. We also have, as I mentioned, a completely fully functional 30-day free trial. And that's what you can see right here. So all of the data, everything that I just showed you can actually be experienced within the free trial as well.
So Sebastian, this was really wonderful. Thank you for taking us through some of these new capabilities in N2WS version 4.2. I do want to mention that this is already available on AWS Marketplace. So if you haven't gotten your hands on it yet, you can just go to AWS Marketplace, deploy the latest version. If you need any support, if you're an existing customer and you want some assistance in getting upgraded, our entire team is focused on this right now and making sure that all of our customers get access to these new capabilities. And just wanted to mention again that everything that we released in Azure is available to everyone. There's no additional licensing required or anything like that. And it's just one single console that you can launch from AWS Marketplace and now from Azure Marketplace as well. And again, if there's any follow-up questions or concerns, the team here is readily available. Just reach out to us and we'll be happy to help you with your N2WS journey. Thank you so much and have a great day.